This sitting is resumed. Senator Trotman, you have the floor.
Madam President, I think I am safe in saying that this debate is arguably the last major task which the Senate will engage in this season. I do not say it will not meet again, but I say major in the scheme of things. And so I think that it is not untimely for me on this occasion to defer to our Prime Minister, particularly in the statement which he has made as a foreword to the document which we are using in conjunction with the estimates of revenue and expenditure. Encapsulated in a sentence, Prime Minister Stewart says, "Truly, we are craftsmen of our future." Now, if one were to read some of the other parts of that introductory statement he made, he said that public servants, members of the private sector, and labor organizations, under the leadership of the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs, and acting head of the Civil Service, Dr. Louis Woodruff, have over the last few months engaged in extensive dialogue which has resulted in the framework contained in this document. And he's careful to say that the framework established in this document is a means to an end and not an end in itself. It is a conduit through which meaningful endeavors may be implemented in order to expedite the recovery efforts. To this end, continuous dialogue with all social partners will remain paramount. I think that it is important for us to remind ourselves of that leading statement, in the same way that I believe it is equally important to look at bits of the leading statements from the other persons who were called upon to add their views. The private sector chairperson says, as part of what he was putting forward, while we acknowledge the broad consensus on the objectives set out in this document, we recognize that implementation plans, which are critical to the success of the objectives, are still to be developed. And he finishes his brief comments by saying, this document represents an improvement in the collaboration of the social partners, which we should strive to further develop and build on in the future. And there were also comments from the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Associations, and in their wind-up comment, they say that the Congress believes that the formulation and implementation of the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018 will strengthen the collaborative mechanisms of the Barbados Social Partnership model. And naturally, I should have a bit more to say about the comment by the General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union, because if I were a working person, that is the organization I would be working for, and then I would have to make sure that I did not set up myself to be fired by my boss. And there are some comments which I believe are critical here, especially since it was my fortune to be involved in much of these discussions and to be aware of what she was writing to Dr. Woodruff when she was asked by him last month whether we could join and send an introductory comment, since, as he made very clear, that introductory comment would in no way and at no time cause a discontinuation of the discussions and the negotiations which were in progress and which were intended to be dealt with at every level before there was any agreement on any of the issues that were being touched upon. And I say that because it is possible for people to read this document and to believe that this is a signed, sealed, and delivered document that sets out a blueprint in detail for what we have to deal with to bring about a recovery plan. The first thing that the BWU says through Ms. Moore is that the union, that's the Barbados Workers Union, recognizes that the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018 is indicative of a major effort which everyone in the country has to make to assist our country to move onto a meaningful recovery path. I'll comment on that later. Goes on to say the Barbados Workers Union accepts that the challenges are myriad and that there are several levels of need that have to be addressed. This union feels, however, that where the objective is to set conditions to permit all groups to benefit, then recovery will be healthy and the entire country will benefit. Approaches to social dialogue, as witnessed during the past 5 years, will not suffice. And I will also need to comment on that. The union understands that as part of its contribution to the national recovery effort, it will have to have its membership share in some moments when sacrifices may have to be made. It considers that meaningful discussion must be held where any such painful decisions will need to undergo a critical examination by all stakeholders. The union further reiterates that measures must be made to reduce the levels of hardship facing some of our citizens. And then our final paragraph, the Barbados Workers Union undertakes openly and in good faith to participate in those parts of the plan where it can render meaningful assistance. It is our hope that with the willingness we should all have to pull together, we will achieve the goals we have set ourselves. Now this, as I said, was a statement written last month, and it was in response to Dr. Woodruff's visit and his clear understanding, as was ours, that we still have a number of issues which were touched on, but on which there was no real debate, and where there is still a great need for discussions, and some of those issues I might be able to touch on this evening. Certainly will try to do so. The question you may ask yourself, Madam President, is what is this framework for our national economic and social development restructuring and enhancement program? NESDREP. For those who will see it in print, they will now know what it refers to. And it is important that we all understand that whatever our individual views and individual wishes as persons and as representatives of various interests, that we are all governed by a recognition that Barbados is in need of some surgery, and that we cannot effectively bring about that operation if only some of us are willing to make the effort. And that therefore all people of all walks of life must be ready to participate. And we must not be ready because we love the leadership of the country, or because we don't love the leadership of the country. We must be ready because if we belong here, and if we have interests here, then we must all believe that each one of us and every one of us has a God-given responsibility to do whatever lies within our power to make for recovery and to bring back the level of economic welfare that we knew we had. We knew that we, as well as many other parts of the world, underwent, and we knew and we know that we can have again. Over the past 5 years, there have been problems. We've been dealing with this issue for a while, and some of those problems have not been good problems. Some of the efforts have not been good, and that is why the General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union indicated that we wanted to have a level of dialogue which was different from the level that we have had in the past 5 years. And it is my understanding that that is a general wish and intention of everybody, and that the leaders of government, of the private sector, and of labor are all committed to an improved level of dialogue. And so that should not be a problem. What may be a problem is a misunderstanding that some may have if they believe that because we have the document, we can put that document in our pockets and abracadabra, everything is fine in Barbados. Life is only like that in Alice in Wonderland. So we have to make an effort. We have to work very hard. And the Prime Minister put it very beautifully when he said that truly we are craftsmen of the future. And I have no doubt that he had in mind not just the words that he has paraphrased in that sentence, but that he was looking much more broadly and much more critically at our national anthem. And within that, I heard a lot of religious comments being made, and I should not be remiss in doing some too. In plenty and in time of need, it speaks about God being the people's guide, not only in times of plenty, but also in times of need. And if you heard Senator DePisa a little while ago, Madam President, she spoke about there being the need for recognition that we live in a community, or we live in a world where cycles visit upon us from time to time, and that there are sometimes the 7 years of plenty, but that we should be ready to understand and to realize that those years of plenty may be followed by the years when the cows were not as fat and there were dearth and famine would set in. What is important for occasions like this, what is important for people like us, is that we keep ourselves informed and that we seek to inform one another so that when we are in times of plenty, we will know what drives our efforts, And when we are in times of need, that wish to share information does not in any way fall off. All of us over the last 2 weeks, in this place, madam, and in the other place, have placed overarching emphasis on the tripartite social partnership and on stakeholder dialogue. And we've also indicated that what was necessary was not merely word-of-mouth participation, but that full participation was necessary. And in that regard, I am pleased to refer you again to the comments made by the Barbados Workers' Union indicating that there is a recognition that even though we are trying to climb the hill, some may say climb the mountain, even though we are trying to make that climb, there may be occasion where we may slip back and where further sacrifices may have to be met. And without being pressured by anyone, the BWU was ready to tell Dr. Woodruff that the BWU is prepared on such occasions to hold a meaningful dialogue and to do whatever lies within its power to give critical support to the efforts that Barbados has to make to recover itself and get back to where we were before. That is not an easy statement to make in the current circumstances, and it's not easy to go and say to somebody who hasn't asked you that we know you may, and when you have to, we are not averse to having that discussion. And all that was being said here is, don't wait only until that moment comes. Let the dialogue be continuous, and let it be meaningful, and let it be transparent. The matter of dialogue, especially tripartite dialogue, needs to be reflected on just for a few minutes. It is not the case in the United Nations system generally, because that United Nations organization normally accepts that there should be government-to-government discussion. And so most of what we do in Barbados or in any other country is that we have officials of government meet with other officials of other governments under the aegis of whoever is the United Nations agency, and decisions are arrived at. It is in the International Labour Organization, however, that it was recognized that if the world was going to have an opportunity to remove poverty from the face of the globe, and if we were going to reduce the level of discrimination of whatever kind we have been talking about, and if we were going to be able to end, well, perhaps end is not the right word, but to reduce war and the levels of war and the causes for those levels of war, then the employers as an agency, as a body, and labor through its representatives were absolutely necessary as partners of government to work together to make the world of work, and hence the communities in which nations were functioning to make those nations a better place. That was so in 1919, anniversary to be celebrated next year in June. Today, that is even more so, even more true. And yet, although with our greater levels of intelligence and experience, we find that there is the contradiction which often sees government's commitment to crafting our future undermined by some leaders, in the case of Barbados, that we leaders sometimes of statutory boards, who have not faced any electorate, but who behave as though they have the last word in the plans that cabinet and government through cabinet with the social partners try to arrive at for the guidance and improvement of our Barbados community. The undermining does not end there. Frequently, that undermining might be found by some public sector managers, not only permanent secretaries, but other managers in public sector, who act as though social dialogue threatens their power, or threatens or interferes with their comfort zones. Take one, take the other, the answer is still the same. And sometimes private sector partners of ministries or of disciplines where government has work to do find themselves getting so powerful that they believe that as private sector partners, they are really private sector owners of Barbados who can disrespect the laws, disrespect the morals, the customs, the regulations, refuse to treat people as working people who have a right to decent treatment, decide that a law is passed, but they are going to flout the law and do what they want, even to putting down buildings of their choosing. And in these circumstances, place governments and government officials in positions where the goodwill that those governments seek to get across to their electorate may be lost because of the narrow-mindedness or sometimes the greed and very often the disrespect of those pockets of people who do not properly understand that when they behave like that, they are spitting into the soup. And we all have to drink that soup. It is untenable, it's unacceptable, and the sooner that things are done with that kind of behavior, the better it is for all of us. And from time to time, you will hear us speaking about these issues, but this is not one of those occasions where we want to, because we are endeavoring to raise the bar for the discussion, and even though sometimes the note may seek to be or sound like a sharp, that is only to make the melody sharper by the end of the anthem. There are some goals which are yet to be worked through in the specifics, but the goal for this recovery plan has been set down by the leader of, well, not the leader of government business, but by the lead debater in this matter, the Honorable Senator Suku, in her presentation. And I don't believe that I need to repeat them, but for those who are in this chamber that hasn't seen them, then it's to be found on Roman 9, page Roman 9, 1 to 6, for those persons who will want to follow that. And nobody, I don't think, Madam President, can argue that any one of these matters is undesirable. It is very necessary for us to be able to deal with all of these things, and I think that we should accept as well that some of them are modest limits that have been put on by the writers and the framers of this particular document, because they realize that where they want to go is not where we can go all at once, or with one long jump or one triple jump, and that we have to get there by stages. In the same way that the theme, the 4 thematic areas, are areas where we have to work ourselves to that position over time as well. And that's to be found on page 11, again using Roman numbering. And there we are talking about fiscal sustainability, about growth, about foreign exchange buoyancy, and about the social services of our country. So we are speaking about desires for all. And if we are speaking about that, we must not give the impression that we have agreements when in fact many of these matters are beyond the here and now. Some are medium-term objectives, and that is set down in some of the themes and indeed in the major goals, because in some cases we are referring to 2021. So some of these matters are still being debated. For example, it is necessary for us to recognize that much discussion was held last year about what is going to be the government's approach to National Housing Corporation housing and to National Housing Corporation housing policy. Much was put on the table regarding what would happen or will happen to the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation, where one of the advisors said that we should sell off the profitable part of that particular institution, the question being, who would buy the unprofitable part? There was also discussion about the Rural Development Corporation and the Urban Development Corporation, discussion about the Hilton Hotel, and particularly some discussion about the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And the part about that that I find interesting to refer to, and we wish to refer to now in passing, is the recommendation that had been made to the committee, and let me hasten to say that the committee, neither at the level of any government officer or the level of any of the other contributors, nobody was ready to accept that what we should do is to take whatever the market would allow in terms of what we would charge the public who would use the hospital services. That was made by an outsider, and nobody in the committees thought that it was something that we should smile with or even embrace anywhere near our persons. And I mention these things, Madam President, not to speak in detail, and surely not to have any conflict with anyone else, but merely to indicate that there's much work to do yet beyond the initial statements of the intent of the parties. So it's a good time to make reference to that so that nobody is under any misapprehensions. But, Madam President, it is also a very good time to congratulate the former Permanent Secretary in Economic Affairs and now Ambassador Bentley Gibbs, and now the new Director of Finance, Dr. Louis Woodruff, and the staff in Finance and Economic Affairs, a group of very young people, and that one or two who may not be young at heart people, who over the last 10 years or so have grown tremendously and have reached a level of professionalism and expertise that makes me proud to be a Barbadian who, having traveled and having seen public servants at work doing delicate and intricate tasks, find myself proud to be able to say, well, that is almost as good as what we have back home in Barbados. They must be congratulated. Madam President, last week in the other place, the leaders of the trade unions got nominated for statehood. Even Mary Redmond and Tony Moore and Arcani Dowell. I got got nominated for sainthood in that place. I was so proud for them. Yeah, makes me a little sorry that it came after my time. And nobody has prayed that it would be a saint. Today, though, Madam President, I posit that not only these persons, but the entire Barbados labor force, at all levels, should be complimented for their patience and long-suffering and their perseverance, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that if we understand that people have aims and aspirations, and they are sometimes grumpy, and some of them blue vets, and yet we have been able to have our country proceed in a manner where extraordinary pressure has not been put on management or on the community as a whole, we should want not only to have those 3 or 4 persons I mentioned brought to sainthood, but we should also wish to spare a prayer that our country's workforce will continue to be as far-sighted and as deep-thinking and as properly committed and patriotic to Barbados as they have been. Can't hear anybody clap for that, but that's all right. Trade unions, Madam President, have a responsibility. All trade unions have a responsibility vigorously to prosecute the demands of their members as they are today, while ensuring that their tomorrow is protected and guaranteed. And it's this particular contradictory position that makes the statement I just made particularly meaningful and makes the occasion one where there needs to be greater levels of respect. Nobody should have refused to respect the fact that Tony Moore or Mary Redmond or Canny Dowell, the president of the prison officers, and other leaders should be given credit for limiting the expressions of disappointment of their members. They all have been disappointed, and I will give at least one reason or two. Someone else here or someone else in the other place may show us where else there is, particularly in the Caribbean, where the conflicts I am referring to, the conflicts of expectations, may have been better handled than so far we have done in Barbados. In our experience, where do we know where there would not have been the closure and even some things even more unpleasant? Labor leaders have done what they thought they should do. They have challenged the governments, but they have been mature enough, having made their positions clear, to exercise a patience which one is not likely to find in environments where people are hurting and where their constituent members are dissatisfied and disenchanted because they are not seeing the results that they paid for. And that has, if nothing else, to be something that goes to the credit of those persons who, at the same time that they want the best that they can get for their members, they also recognize that this rock is a peculiar rock. I mean, this country is a peculiar country in that we don't have any hills with fruit trees in abundance where you can go and pick those fruit, or where you can go and get alternative forms of livelihood by getting wild fruit or any fruit. Or you can get animals? well, the animals that are there are not animals that we would be allowed to deal with, especially with the groups that don't like to see monkeys troubled in any way. So I don't think we can find any other approach except one that recognizes that though these are difficult times, we have to keep the dialogue going, and we have to persuade to the extent that it may be possible by moral suasion. I do not say, for I do not speak for leadership of trade unions in that way. I do not say that tomorrow you may not find that if you don't get recognition from one or two companies that we have told the minister about, that there may not be a stoppage. I do not say that if we don't hear from the government regarding some things that we may talk about in a minute or two, that they may not take positions. I merely say that as we look at what we have today, as we look at how the partnership has addressed the issues, we have been satisfied that words come cheaply, but that one has to be mature enough to understand and recognize reality when one sees it. We heard during these talks, for example, a statement which perhaps had not been made after careful enough thought. Or careful that says that if the government laid off people, the private sector would pick up those jobs. Now, my experience has been that where the government lays off people, the government comes around behind those and lays off, where government lays off, the private sector comes around behind government and lays off comparable numbers, because while the government has its aim to be the well-being of everyone, and government still has to recognize that it is the employer in the last resort. An employer is not governed by that consideration and cannot be blamed for making profit the center and the end all of his economic or financial exercise. So when that was said by employers, we slowed down in our discussions, because that was a contradiction which did not go down well and did not seem to have the meaning we all wanted. We've had this contradiction before now, and those who are in the room who may be just over 50 rather than those who are approaching 50 may remember that in the 1990s, long time ago, in the 90s, we had a similar problem. Because the IMF, you may recall, had invaded Barbados, and we had a problem. And the partners, although I recall that there were some interests that said we should have devalued, I recall having fights with some people. I do not refer to where they came from, because this is not the season to do that. But the trade union movement, putting Barbados first, second, and possibly third, took a position that one of the big things that divided the nation was over the government's cutback of the 8%. And the leader of the labor movement at the time got agreement from his colleagues that that matter, Senator Husbands might confirm this, that matter was not one where we were going to shut down Barbados. We demonstrated to make the government understand, but we decided, deliberately decided, let the matter be dealt with in the courts, and let tourism, which was the only thing keeping Barbados ticking over, let tourism continue apace without there being the possibility for the economy to be shattered because we took stronger, more aggressive measures. Of course, we were not praised for that by all people. And tomorrow, we will not be praised for it by many people. But leaders have, in their wisdom, to discuss with their constituents and their members regarding what are the best opportunities and what are the best avenues through which we can deal with the immediacy of the demander of that worker, while at the same time guaranteeing that there is security for that person tomorrow or down the road. The special interest in this debate springs from that kind of dichotomous arrangement. Naturally, workers in Barbados have an interest in the nature of the Barbados Recovery Program, and they will want to get reports from their leadership in much the same way that I believe the private sector will want reports from their spokespersons regarding what they are able to achieve. And we must recognize that the objectives, though all may be for the betterment of Barbados, when the objectives are broken down into their segments, it may very well be that the objective of the worker may not be on all fours with the objective of the business person, and that government may not be in a particular season on the same wavelength as the worker. And so the social dialogue has to be of paramountcy so that we can see how we can best take those diverging views and bring them into a consensual platform, onto a consensual platform where there can be some levels of agreement. So the interest lies in the nature of that recovery. The interest lies as well in there being a preliminary look at what will be the offer in the medium term. And that is not something that we could easily treat with, because we are treating in this document with many variables, and in many cases there are several actors who are going to impact on the outcomes. And what we can only hope for is that the level of commitment will be great enough so that there is no likelihood of our departing from where we gave our commitment. The interest is further in the daily preoccupation of our citizens. If we are too worried about the future of our jobs, if we are too worried about the security of our homes, or our safety on the roads going home from work, if we are too worried about the safety of our persons working side by side with others, or the safety of our children at school because the upsurge of violence is not contained as we are all hoping it will be contained, and if we are not sure about the appointments that there will be in the public service or in the private sector, and that our future, then once we are finished, whether we go at 50, 55, or 67, that a retirement program is there so that we could benefit from it, then the way that we will look at whatever plan that there is, recovery or otherwise, is going to be frustrated. We have a responsibility, therefore, to recognize that in every instance, it may not be necessary for us to look only at financial issues, because we are made up of several different interests, and we will from time to time have to move beyond whether there is a coping fee or coping subsidy or scoping subsidy or whatever you choose to call it, and we have to move to see whether there's a wage adjustment, and if there is, then when, and if there's not, then why not? We have to be able to bring the transparency into those discussions that have been escaping the parties, and therefore in their escape have been causing levels of disaffection, which we must be ready to remove from this environment. Now, each of us is anxious to see what action plans there will be to realize the goals in the NESDREP, the recovery program. We have insisted in the labor movement that we want to help, but we have also insisted, and that was a major source for disaffection, that you can only help if you get information that is meaningful. The promise has been given on this occasion in this document, and one has to hope that those discussions will be held with the information given, and one has to understand, as Senator Worrell has said, that that information, while it needs to be given, has to be treated with a level of respect and confidentiality that will be required from time to time. We will also be anxious, particularly at this season, and particularly since some officials who previously thought that we should retain all the public sector jobs, but who are now saying that we should get rid of more than 5,000 jobs, we all have to be anxious regarding whether there will be another tranche of layoffs, and whether that is around the corner, and who will speak to it. My understanding is an understanding that we, in this debate so far, recognize and have spoken to the value of our being assured as a nation about what will happen to this country if we lay off a whole multitude of people and where they would go. And I would think that we would have to do a fast job of reopening Glenderry to add to Dawes and wherever else, because if people can't get work, they themselves may not mind going hungry for a night or a day, but if their children look into their faces and say that they are hungry, there are not many parents who will not do whatever is possible to make sure that their children have some measure of succor. So we have to be careful about how we treat this matter of layoffs. And I am pleased where I recognize that as a partnership, as a government, as a union, as a Barbadian public, that we recognize that Barbados cannot afford the luxury of further layoffs. We are anxious as well, Madam President, to get our purchasing power treated so that our standard of living does not degenerate beyond our capacity to recover. We have had lots of challenges. People have been annoyed, but by and large, they have grumbled, but they have worked along in the expectation that we are going to see better days and that we are going to have recovery where some of those impositions will in fact be returned sooner rather than later. The longer it takes, the greater will be our effort to recover, and the greater will be the level of disaffection on the part of our constituents. Some few other thoughts, because I suspect, Madam President, that I may have, yeah, may have 10 minutes, okay. 10 minutes. All right, Madam. I want to make an observation arising out of some things which we had spoken about, but which Senator Watson made reference to, and earlier, well, yesterday really, Senator Lady Haynes made reference to. Senator Watson made reference to small and medium-term enterprises, micro small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is carried on page 24, I think. But I believe what Senator Watson may have been saying, surely my interpretation of what he was saying, is that there ought to have been a greater highlighting of this particular issue. And where that is said, I think it's fair comment. There is a little section there, but you have to read it within the arrangement. 24. Page 24?
Yeah, there's a lot in the framework.
In the framework itself. But I think, though, that sometimes headlines are the only thing that you see. And very often in the newspaper, the headline may not be the story. But the person has seen the headline and has walked away with the wrong story. So headlining is not an improper approach. But his point regarding manufacturing, his point regarding the local and the small business person, his point regarding how we can work more closely together beyond those initial discussions which we have had before, is a point which I believe that the negotiating teams will want to work on much more assiduously. And I know that at least one senator in this room has been involved at some level in those discussions, and that he can take that on board as well. There will have to be further discussions as well regarding the size of operators in some businesses. We see a lot of large businesses taken over, some in tourism, some elsewhere, and there has to be sufficient room that is known and understood, that is left so that the small entrepreneur, the small business person, be it the taxi man, be it the person in the industrial estate or wherever else, that person will be able to see the opportunity for development. And I like the idea raised by Senator Lady Haynes last night, yesterday, where we talked about land and land being available. We know that that has been a part of a plan, and it has to be addressed even more fully, because a lot of young people today are in fact interested in going back to agriculture, but that is provided they are going to work for themselves. And we have to see that as an opportunity. And then I want to be concerned that if we are going to make this plan work, if we are going really to try and to turn around this economy, we can't do so just because we have people on the job. We must do so because we have trained people on the job. And regrettably, I have to make the point that even though the National Initiative for Service Excellence and its leadership has in the past, and possibly still is, doing a fine job in trying to make employers understand the relevance and importance of having ongoing, regular, meaningful training in the jobs and in the environment in which the job is carried out. And even though we have had studies and study groups overseas, and we have seen that training runs into weeks for companies that we have used when we have sought to make standards. When it comes to Barbados, we are selling ourselves short because employers are satisfying themselves with half their training programs, or at most one-day training programs. Now, I do not know how much anybody who has been working for 5, 6, 7 years, who is bothered about the difficulties about work and raising a family, how that person going to work at 8 o'clock and going to a training program at 9 and finishing at 1 o'clock. I don't know how that is going to change the price of milk. I think that if we are going to work to really turn around this country, the levels of productivity, and I am a union leader and I'm ready to say that this is so, because we have said so and we have been in print to say the levels of productivity are nothing for us to write home about. I remember that some years ago, the Barbados port that Senator Hunt spoke so glowingly about yesterday. And I want to make the record understand that I have the greatest respect for John Marine. But that port was boasting about how we were #1 as a port in the Caribbean. And for 6 years. And my position, I was General Secretary then, so I don't want to get mixed up and say I was flying past my nest. My comment then was, so why are you expressing this great degree of satisfaction? You are #1 when you compare, and I name the islands around the Caribbean, which I don't need to refer to in a public address. So what benefit is there for you if you are the Muhammad Ali in the boxing arena and you're boxing with Reggie Hunt from the village? I don't mean Senator Hunt. I mean Reggie Hunt from the village. What is the benefit? You have to start comparing yourself upstairs. You don't compare yourself where you are always going to be the best. Because when you start comparing yourself as a port with others who were doing much better, and I gave examples, then you know when you start seeing the incidents of improvement. And we still want to do that in our levels of productivity. When you compare us with regions in the Latin American and Caribbean region, we don't have a story to tell. And we have to do something about it. But you can't bring somebody straight out of school or straight off the block and tell them where the bathroom is and where the cash register is, and then send them to work and expect that they're going to be Einsteins on the job, or what the lady was that was a nurse that became a saint, Madam, yeah. Anyhow, whoever. Madam Teresa. And the same thing goes for efficiency. You don't pick that up because you were walking down, going to the bus, and you find it dropped like a penny on the side of the street. You have to work towards these things. And this is why we are arguing that if we are going to improve, we can't just rely on what benefits they will come to us by government subsidies or by government legislation. We have, whether it is at the level of the labor movement, at the level of the employer, at the level of the worker himself or herself, to make sure that we learn the best we can, we develop the best habits, we take the greater levels of efficiency, but we have to position Barbados to be at the very top. Now I have to go quickly because I have one more important thing to talk about. A very important remark was made yesterday by Senator Walcott, and I have no doubt that he came back just to see if I remembered. And I think that if we are going to be ready for a full partnership, which all the partners, the government, the employers, and the union spoke to, then we have to make sure that the commitments we make, particularly to small businesses, which are part of the partnership, must be commitments which are honored. And naturally I speak of UCAL, but I don't speak about UCAL alone. I speak about UCAL now because UCAL has not been able to do well because the funds which are the property of UCAL have not been forthcoming, and we still haven't got them. But more than that, we have written to say that since we are owed money,
Honorable member has one more minute.
thank you so kind, ma'am. Since we are owed money, let us have some of that money so we can buy some buses, sit down with you first and discuss it, buy some buses and assist in the transportation system for school kids. And if that was worked out, we would be able to have UCAL, we can repair the buses, and we get other buses as well. We will do the transport. We will work into a collaborative arrangement with the transport board, and when the buses were not taking school kids, we might have been able to have those buses work in the peak seasons so that we would be able to expedite the transport of people to work and from work. We're yet to hear a response to that, but we notice that some people who already are involved in the business are likely yet again to remove the possibility for UCAL to be able to realize the plans that the government had, which was to make working people owners of their own business, managers of their own future, and therefore to make real, true, and practical the words of the Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, Right Honorable Frendel Stewart, that we are, in fact, truly craftsmen of our future. I thank you, ma'am.